You know me. I like to get the bombshell out of the way early. I gave this game a net negative score on the golden number. Go ahead. Get out of the way. Attacks, insults, rage. Go ahead and close the video in disgust. Alright, now that all those people have left, where do I begin? I suppose the easiest way to begin is by stating that this is yet another case of a game that I understand why people like it so much. I've talked about this before. Because it's unique or interesting or fun or creative or zany, or it does something that everything else, doesn't do quite the same way. I will use a personal example. I tend to enjoy Star Wars Rebellion. But if I was to do a review of Star Wars Rebellion, it would probably score a net negative because that game is problematic and awful. But it's also the only grand strategy / 4X Star Wars game that I can play. In fact, it's the only one that exists, unless you count mods for things like Stellaris. And so you can see why I enjoy it, right? There are other examples like that, but I think you get the concept. But this game's interesting because it's a bad platformer with just, it's so obvious that these people had no idea how to make a platformer and were just kind of making it up as they go. It feels very early PS2 in terms of its construction. Its animations are awkward. Its platforming, that is to say, the collision and the actual floatiness of the jumps themselves are off. I forget what it's called, but the adherence thing, where you grab a ledge or whatever, or you interact with the little sliding things, like the Sonic things, right? Where you can, I don't know what to call those, the rails, I suppose. That doesn't work right. Physics just kind of goes wherever. The camera has no idea what it's doing half the time and likes to just kind of clip through things or around things. In several cases, the bosses are designed in ways that are very clearly more in adventure logic. In fact, speaking of which, this game is very clearly an adventure game that happens to be a platformer. We've talked about this before, like Head-On isn't really an FPS, it's an RPG. Same concept. This is very clearly an adventure game. So many of the solutions and methods of progression are more figure out which item to rub on which other item, as opposed to actually just jumping and navigating and maneuvering through the platforming puzzle, the level. Whether that's good or bad is up to you. I'm just mentioning it because it adds to the feeling of disjointedness throughout the whole game. Now, that's not even getting into Meat Circus. But I suppose I should get into Meat Circus and just get that out of the way. Because I had several other complaints about several other aspects of the gameplay, most notably several levels and several bosses. But Meat Circus takes the cake. This is kind of a spoiler because it's the final stage, and it sucks. But what's really funny is if you zoom in a little bit, Meat Circus is just all the problems of the rest of the game, all of them, crammed into one overly lengthy, absolutely frustrating section. The audio spam is through the roof. The fact that you have to do very precise jumping on things that don't always acknowledge that you're there because it's janky. Reminder, jank just means something doesn't work right, and this is a very janky game. That's frustrating as hell. It doesn't really have proper mid-mission checkpoints. It likes to use the escort mission concept. It's got a timer twice, actually. Like, the whole thing, and the music and the visuals are all jarring and disjointed. And I don't mean in a, it's in a nightmare kind of way, which is probably what they were going for. I mean in a, it's actually irritating to go through kind of a way. When I actually beat Meat Circus, I muted the game in order to get through a certain part of it, because I was just tired of hearing the constant audio spam and the ear-splitting music, and that's on top of the visuals, which were jarring and bad textures and all other fun stuff like that. So the whole thing was just, ugh. And that's before you get to the final boss. This is a fun little factoid. So the the first final boss has 3 attacks. He'll do kung with his cleavers. He'll do a side swipe, and he'll do a forward swipe. Okay? Now, you can dodge these, of course, but there's no iframes to the dodge. So instead, you need to either be out of the range of them, or you can block with the shield. Here's a fun thing. In order to beat the first boss, you have to have him do the downward swing, get stuck, climb up his arm, and then hit him in the face. Cool. Problems. First of all, if you block that attack, it doesn't happen. So you have to only block the other 2 attacks. Actually, there's a third attack. If he gets close to you, he kicks, but that's whatever. And then you have to successfully move out of the way of that attack when it actually comes in. Okay, that's reasonable. A little irritating to do because of the controls issues, but doable, right? Then you have to climb up his arm. Anybody who watched the stream can know you have a very tight window to get up that arm. And while you're trying to get up it, you're falling off the arm because of the aforementioned collision issues and the jank. And if you're paying attention, almost all of the complaints I've been mentioning, because I could keep going. I could talk about the audio spam from the dad. I could talk about how there were points in which I was doing the climbing section where you have to climb on the fence and the double jump literally didn't happen, like just went away for no reason. All of this stuff is the kind of stuff that polish and time would have fixed. This is a game that with a proper remake to just go through and remake the content in a new engine with modern concepts and time and money could probably be a very, very good game. And that's what's so frustrating about it to me. Because even though I give this game a net negative score, which I stand behind, almost all of that is on the gameplay axis, which was, I think it was something like a net negative 20 to gameplay, which is huge. But at each step of the way, you could see the bones of what they were going for. One of the bosses you fight from the boss's perspective, the lungfish, and it's not actually a boss so much as a level. And you're going through this whole level with him doing it. And as I was going through it, I was thinking, you know what this reminds me of? Over in Mario Galaxy, there's levels where there's like flashlight levels, and that's the part of the level you can go through. And those are great and awesome levels, but that's because those levels were very carefully polished and crafted. And this is why I talk so much about execution when it comes to video games. Because having good ideas is not enough. You have to implement them properly. You have to actually do them and do them well. It's one of the reasons I tend to be so pro core Nintendo games, the actual core Nintendo development team. It's because while their games may or may not be particularly interesting or innovative, they tend to be polished. Not always, obviously. See the Sunshine Rumination, but you get the idea, right? Which I suppose brings me to my final thought on the gameplay. I have seen several people mention this. Quite a few actually mention this as their favorite platformer, or one of their favorite platformers, or a game they love to replay or whatever. And I can see why. Because it's the same reason I like Star Wars Rebellion, right? Either it fills a niche, or it's neat, or it's unique, or it's zany, or it's whatever, right? How many games do what this game does? One of the first stage, actually the first stage, arguably, has a whole thing where you are standing on a cube and you can maneuver around it, and the camera just kind of adjusts the whole stage for that. That's cool. There's a section where we have to race down. God, I'm forgetting specifics, of course. There's a section where where you turn into a giant person and smash your way through a city, or try not to kill people, which is what I was doing. There's a section where you have to go through this literal jigsaw of someone's mind, trying to get items in order to gain access to other items, because that disguises you as them. And there's a section where you have to go through and play a board game by doing tiny little side quest kind of missions in order to unlock pieces to use against the enemy forces. There's cool concepts throughout the whole game. It is my fervent hope that Psychonauts 2 keeps this core element of uniqueness and fun and just interesting, engaging concepts and actually polishes them properly and makes them into legitimately fun gameplay. I say that in such a way because for those of you who don't know, we're playing Psychonauts 2 today, and also I've never played it before. I'm walking in almost totally blind. The only thing I know about it is that it exists. So, that'll be interesting. But anyways, but none of you care about the gameplay. Right? Who cares about gameplay? We're not here for gameplay. Well, tough. We're going to talk about the gameplay for just a little bit more. Because the whole reason I keep bringing this up is there's a tag that I have on the site I call garbage. And games like this are why that tag exists. I'm sorry. I'm making it sound like this game got the garbage tag, which it did not, for the record. What I mean by that is a game that gets a net negative golden number, which I stand behind, I want to re-stress that, isn't the worst thing ever. It just has many problems and many concepts, and honestly, you're better off going and watching the final level on YouTube rather than actually doing it, because the final level is absolute drivel. But the rest of the game at least has, ideas and concepts and promise and can be something. A game that's garbage can't be improved. Game that gets the garbage tag, that game is screwed. That game needs a complete and total reimagining, an overhaul from the base, from the ground up, in order to actually be turned into something worth a damn. This game needs some polish, and that's the distinction. Narrative. Now, ironically, I don't have much to say about the narrative. So, with that, we'll cut off. No, I am joking. I really don't have much to say. But I do want to talk about a couple of things that really caught my eye. First of all, do you notice the intro is very Star Wars? Now, I talked about this. I'm going to be repeating several things I said on stream. So if you saw the stream, this is probably a good time to go ahead and pause the video and not watch the video and downvote the video and dislike the video. Don't share. Don't subscribe. Don't. The beginning of Star Wars, what do we see first? Well, the first thing we see is the Tantalus Flower and the Star Destroyer Devastator, Imperial Star Destroyer Devastator. And then we see the droids, which is what we open on. This was an inspired choice. At the time, I've talked about this in several of my Star Wars videos before. At the time, this was considered insane. You know, trying to start a movie like this that's doing its own thing, that's kind of trying something new, without actually starting with your hero, or starting with one of your main characters. Now, you could argue whether 3PO or R2 qualifies or not, but the point is, the movie doesn't start with Luke. In fact, some of you are probably going to point out that the movie almost started with Luke, and indeed, there was actually footage shot to start the movie with Luke. But eventually, and inevitably, they decided not to do that, which was the right call. Because what'd they do? They established the premise, you know, space battles, first thing we see. They establish the stakes, the villain, Darth Vader. They establish several of the characters, including 3PO, R2, and Princess Leia. And we also establish, and it is, I do mean established, it's not just they're there on screen. She gives this desperate video, then grabs a gun and fights to defend herself. And she talks back to Vader. So the point is, they actually bother to do things to establish. And then we cut down. And then we go through the lengthy section of trying to have a pause, a bit of a breather, really kind of developing a little bit more of the interaction between the two characters and the loneliness and emptiness of the world below before we finally interact with Luke. And all of this is build up and prep work so that when we do finally meet Luke, we're on board for it, for lack of a better way to put it. We have context and information and everything we need to know about why we care about this. Now, what am I... let me talk about Star Wars for the next hour. The reason I mentioned this is while this intro isn't quite as well crafted, it is still very clearly pulling off the same trick. What's the first thing we see? A big speech by Oleander about what the Psychonauts are, establishing the premise. This is the nature of this world. These are psychic super soldiers and super spies, very James Bond / The Incredibles kind of a thing, who fight psychically and jump into people's minds and do all kinds of stuff. Cool. Premise established. The next thing we establish is tone. We establish kind of the feel, vibe, and atmosphere because we cut to the kids, and they joke and they laugh and they make fun of each other. Cool. All that's done. We also do a little bit to establish some of the early characters and the support cast, both the kids and the teachers, who themselves are Psychonauts. Then we move on to establish the main character. And that's when we're actually introduced. And again, we are established early on. We are acrobatic. We are powerful psychically, very strong mental defenses. And we are very vested in doing this and, of course, really want to be a part of this thing. And then we establish why. The whole dad, we need to do this. We have a ticking clock, and now we have our stakes. Then the game starts. Brilliant intro. Legitimately. And I was actually really impressed by how efficiently and well done the intro was, especially in contrast to the outro, but I'll get to that in a minute. Now I'm going to fast forward a little bit, because like a good adventure game, one of the things this game does well, especially early on, mostly early on, is you can run around and talk to people and interact with them. And like an adventure game, you can use virtually everything you get on every character you see. This includes the specific psychic powers you get as you progress through your training, but also in several of the literal items you can hold and interact with them that way. And you see how the adventure logic kind of starts to, or the adventure game kind of seeps into the game here. But it does that and does it well, and it's slightly less irritating than it could be, so that's neat. Then we go ahead and move forward and start to do our first few stages. I'm going to skip through a couple of these because whatever. The thing that caught me the most is how almost everyone here has some issue or another. I also noticed that they lay several world-building seeds pretty early. We know that this place used to be in another area which was abandoned and is now this camp because of the Psychonauts, which causes issues for some people but can also magnify other people's minds. Obviously, this has a direct effect on Cruller. Poor guy. He actually straps a bit of titanium to his back so he can leave the cave later. And consequently, we see that Psychonauts can run out because his runs dry, so that's its own thing. And also, there's an insane asylum across the lake, which at first glance is like, why? But then you realize people go insane around here, and yeah, okay, that tracks. I mean, Arkham Asylum's cursed, we all know that. So we get a lot of establishment, and we also get a little bit of establishment on the characters, the supporting cast, and how they interact with each other. Pretty early on, we find out about, I forget his name, and Mikhail, and the two connect, and then they're going to go do their whole thing. And everyone will pay for going against me. We also see the two cheerleaders, both of whom are suicidal. Get that daily mandated suicide in there. Thanks, YouTube. But I mean that without joking. One of the first things we see about them, I believe the second thing we see about them is they're preparing poison to kill themselves, which doesn't work. So then they're prepared to jump, which obviously doesn't work either, because, And the whole time it's just like, wow, that's... Okay. Everyone here has issues, and that makes sense. This is a bunch of people who are psychics. This is why I mentioned the tone being established early is so important. Because this is not a game for kids, or to be more accurate, this is not a kid's game, and thank God for that. Sorry, I shouldn't be so negative. I know a lot of people have fond memories of the Nickelodeon era. I am not one of those people. So, what we have instead is a game that feels more like a dark story told through the lens of a child, as opposed to being a kid's story, which happens to have dark elements. Most of these kids being ostracized or having problems or being sent here to help train them or whatever makes sense for the same reason that a lot of people would send mutants to Xavier's school for the gifted students, right? You either want to get rid of them, or they have issues, or you want them to get better. And all of these motivations exist in the backstories of these kids. And we see a bit of a gambit in their perspectives and mindsets as well, how sane or how issue problematic several of them are in relation to each other. So that all makes sense. We also see that the staff are also a little bit off. There are actually several hints about Oleander early on. By the way, this is going to go ahead and be your spoiler warning. But the more important part is we see how Mila is just good with all the kids and kind of automatically serves as a motherly role for everybody. And Sasha hides away in his lab doing experiments, staying as far away from people as he possibly can. And this tracks for both of them. They are in many ways opposite, but also, well, it tracks in how their level design works. I mentioned I was going to skip through a few things, but I want to mention two things that really struck me here. Sasha's mind seems very disciplined and orderly, and that's a lie, because it's actually very organized and very fragile. Not to borrow a metaphor from the later level with, what's his name? The Velvetopia. But his mind is a bit of a house of cards. The moment anyone or anything interrupts anything and it goes wrong, it all falls apart, and he actually needs help from us as part of a tutorial in order to fix it. Now, this makes sense. We tend to associate organized with disciplined, but the two are not the same thing. And in fact, his issue, if you will, actually seems a little bit to be a mild form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Things have to be X. If they are not X, then we have a problem. Then we move on to Mila. Now, she's much more interesting because she has this wild, wacky, zany thing, and she's just exuding positivity and talking about the party and being a generally flirtatious personality. Thing is, I saw several people in chat, and I've noticed some comments about this too, that say that she's trying to hide away from her trauma and her tension, or all the terrible things that she's gone through, and I disagree with that completely. Actually, I think she's probably the mentally healthiest person of all of the people that we see in this game. And I mean that. Because there's two big things that stuck out for me, and I wrote down both of them. I actually do have notes for this game. It's a rare thing for a game this short. But I do have notes here, and the two things that really jumped out at me are, A, she has locked it away. Now, you might be thinking, I thought it was bad to bottle up thoughts. It's not what I mean. How many of you, God, I hope the answer is 0, have been through something traumatic? Now I have. I've been through 3 major things, and I do have post-traumatic stress. I do still have issues with that. I still deal with that. But one of the biggest things when it comes to mental health for that kind of post-trauma is not locking it away, but ensuring that it doesn't interact with the rest of your thoughts. So in short, it's there, but it's separate, segregate. It's not bleeding out. It's not causing issues. It's not affecting the overall rest of your thought process. And lo and behold, her trauma about that is locked away in its own separate area, not bleeding out into the rest of the stage. Second point, this is also important. When we get there, she doesn't freak out. She's like, no, you shouldn't be there, but that's it. And that's important because someone who has actually coped, past tense, with their trauma, obviously doesn't want that trauma to be re-examined, but if brought up, they will not freak out about it because they've coped. They've handled it. They've dealt with it, just like she has. She has come to grips with that terrible and dark part of her life. And it's over there. It's a part of her, but it doesn't affect the rest of her life. So the woman who seems all zany and happy and carefree is, because she's dealt with it. That's cool. I like how that's constructed. Now, you notice I kind of skipped over Oleander's mind. This struck me about midway through the game. It didn't even occur to me until I'd already finished, I think, the second streaming block. And I was just like, wait a second. Because I was analyzing how each of their levels, was an insight into how their minds were and what particular mental health issue they were going through. And Oleander's doesn't really seem to indicate his trauma, but you know what it does indicate? His power. Later on in the game, we see he is a very powerful psychic, someone who can actually take on 3 other armed psychic agents at the same time and essentially call it a draw. And he's the one who came up with the thing for the tank and had the plan to do blah, blah, blah. So he is a fairly powerful, very disciplined individual. Also, right towards the beginning, if you caught it, one of the kids bothered to say something which was along the lines of, he is a really strong psychic. Once you go into his brain, you can't leave unless he lets you. And then what do we see in that tutorial level? We see a whole course which is designed around this whole theme, which he is projecting, which is not his actual thoughts. And he has total control over it. Now that's key, because neither Mila nor Sasha had control over their minds. They had a degree of control, but the game even bothers to point this out. There's this pseudo joke of Sasha being like, I am your creator, I command you to stop. And the censor bot says no, of course, because that's what censor bots do. The end. But he, that is to say, Oleander, had such control over his own mind that he could enter people, reassociate, eject them, and change its format at will, as part of the tutorial, but also as a bit of foreshadowing for how strong he was. So that tracks. The next one we see is Lungfishopoulos. I forget the exact name. Now, there's not much to say about this one, but it does actually share a bit of insight into something which is really messed up. That is how normalized someone can be programmed, for lack of a better way to put it. If you make something extraordinarily ordinary, then they tend to not question it. And I love that level, by the way. It's my favorite stage in the entire game. But I think it's the only stage that got no negatives whatsoever, even on the gameplay axis. Could have been better, admittedly, but still very cool. But the thing is, if you were paying attention, it's the entire stage with the little tidbits, the dialogue that the fish are saying, the opening cutscene, the way it's structured, the very nature of their mind being a city, so that can then serve a particular order. All of that is kind of similar to how you can ordinize. That's a new word. You can credit me on that, or don't. I don't care. Ordinize something that they're being told to do so that they just keep doing it. The mind control in this case. Then we move on a little bit. We see the milkman, excuse me. Now, I'm not sure what Boyd's actual mental health issue is. We see that the reason he was sent to the asylum was for destroying his former place of work with, Molotovs for having done, and then he got picked up by Oleander and got recruited and yada yada. But I look at that, and what I see is someone with a form of schizophrenia, which I know is vague and doesn't actually define it because, and I talked about this on stream too, we're at the point now where whatever I'm saying about mental health is already out of date And in a year, we'll probably be proven to be wrong. We actually have been developing our knowledge and understanding of mental health quite a bit in the last few years. It's actually been pretty cool. But as we've been seeing, there's a lot of gradients to what otherwise wouldn't be seen. So when I say schizophrenia, I don't mean split personality. We'll be seeing that in a minute. No, I mean someone who actually has a schizophrenic personality, someone who has tints of actual paranoia. As I like to say, paranoia does not mean you are cautious or hesitant. It means you think your socks are trying to kill you. This, of course, doesn't help from the fact that he is literally programmed, which it's 2 of those now, which brings us, of course, to Gloria. Actually, I'm going to skip Gloria and go to Fred first. I know we do Gloria's stage first, but whatever. The point is, in Fred's stage, what we see is the whole, the other identity, the Napoleon, which takes over because he's so weak and pathetic and terrible, and this is much more dissociative identity disorder, dissociative identity disorder. There we go. DID, aka actual multiple personalities. Usually tacked in with something along the lines of shame or self-esteem issues, but honestly, every single one of these has self-esteem issues, so that's whatever. By the way, the Waterloo stage is probably my second favorite stage in the game. Great stuff there. I don't have much to say about that other than it makes sense that the way that this works out is that he convinces himself that he's good enough to not need his other personality, and therefore ejects the other personality, which is a state he desires. This, of course, brings us to Gloria. This one's messed up because this is straight up bipolar. Now, I've actually known bipolar people in real life, and that's not fun, to put it as bluntly as I can. It's unpleasant. I don't mean it's not fun being. I mean, bipolar is not fun. It's horrible. But one of the things I was impressed by was during the during the theater stage, let's put it that way, there were several moments at which they went out of their way to show the same event, but from a different perspective, which kind of changed the mentality and appropriation, the memory of that event, which is very bipolar. What I mean by that is most people assume, in my experience, that bipolar just means you flip-flop between emotions, but actually it tends to mean that you are looking through multiple different lenses at the same event simultaneously. So something happens to you, and part of you is looking at it thinking, oh, that's awesome, and part of you is looking at it thinking, oh, that's terrible, and so forth and so on. And so you actually effectively make multiple memories of these events, depending on how your brain is working at that certain point in time. Which, of course, takes us right into Velvetopia, and whatever his name is. I can't remember his name. Steve Blum! I know he's in this game several times. Not sure what's going on there. My first thought, and I'll take some input on this one if anybody has any thoughts, but my first thought was monomania. Someone who is fixative, who is just absolutely this, and this has to be this way, because this, and it's basically a mental 30 go to 10, right? Well, how about this? Well, because this. Well, how about this? Because this. Why don't I do this? Well, because of this. And he keeps fixating on this one event and this one moment and all that. And that's horrible in its own way. There's probably some more self-esteem issues. I know it's a common trend. But in the end, I absolutely loved the outro to his stage where they're just being pathetic and he's just like, and just opens the door and lets them plummet. Walks away for a second. Pauses. Opens it again for a just crack so he can hear them splat, and then closes it again. Now, that's amusing, but it's also appropriate because mentally that is exactly what he needed. He needed to not care about their fate, to be the person they needed to not have the power over him, not be able to affect him. I'm saying this so wrong because I'm trying to convey a complex thought with a few sentences. But the idea here is it's not that you don't care about them in the strictest sense. It's more that the level to which you care is entirely on you. They have no power over you. You have power over you. And that's what he demonstrates there. So then we go to the end game. We have an irritating crawl up the tower with those damned mice. And then we see Tara Strong doing the squeakiest voice I think I've ever heard her do. And the extremely adventure game fight, if you could even call it that, against Dr. Loboto, whatever, however they pronounced it. I don't even know what to say about that. So we're just going to move on to the finale where we combine our mind with Oleander's. And we find out that Oleander has some issues. I feel that the outro on a narrative axis kinda sucks. In fact, I was rather unkind. The only story negative I gave the entire game was for the outro. Think about that for a second. And I gave like 5 gameplay negatives. But anyways, Meat Circus. The point is, okay, so his dad used to kill bunnies and he loves bunnies and they're just meat and whatever. And one of the things that's actually mentioned very early on, very, very early on, as early as Sasha's thing, is stuff is not always the same in your mind as it is in real life. Right? And this makes perfect sense because we only have a few tidbits to know exactly what his father was actually like. How he actually operated, how he functioned, etc. You know, whether he was this terrible of a dad or not. Because we certainly know how our dad is, because he irritates us the entire way through the stages. Rasputin, audio spam for 20 minutes every 30 seconds. Oh my, sorry, I really hated the last stage. But narratively speaking, I feel it's absent, and that's its biggest flaw. We could probably fill in the gaps, but I don't care enough to do so. So if anybody wants to, feel free to do so. I know there's an in-between game which we will not be playing. Like I said, we're jumping right into Psychonauts 2 next. But I'm wondering if any ancillary works have ever fleshed out Oleander and his past or any of this a little bit more, because the game kind of doesn't. He had a traumatic experience when he was a kid. The end. That's it. That's his backstory. And he decided to go from that to, I'm going to kidnap children's brains to conquer the world with psychic death tanks. Now, if you don't understand, you're probably thinking, but this is a kid's game. As I've already established, no, it isn't. That's the problem. In fact, one of the things that apparently they did was they deliberately put certain things like blood and meat and repeated usage of low-level cuss words specifically to raise the game's rating so that kids would not accidentally buy it, because this was not intended to be a game for kids. So no, it isn't. And the game has been trying to make sense, especially with this mental health issue, several times. So my point is, I feel like there was an intent to flesh out Oleander more, as they did most of the other mines we go into, and they didn't because they ran out of time. One of the things I really didn't like about the outro, to really complain about this for a second, is the presentation. What I mean by that is animations literally look unfinished. In some cases, there's just a jump cut transition instead of actually showing the transition from one thing to the other, you know? And in some cases, there's just actively bad or absent storyboarding. The level of doodad usage, level of detail in the backgrounds is almost non-existent. It's just, there's all sorts of lack of polish, and this is still true from a storytelling perspective. And then Oleander is redeemed instantly for some reason. Off camera, actually, if we're being blunt about this. I did like the bit with our dad, and I did like the bit where, you know, we do join the Psychonauts, the adventure will continue. Cool. I imagine they were hoping to get a sequel. They were very disappointed because this game didn't sell particularly well. And I'm just going to be real really quick. I know we didn't want to talk too much about the behind the scenes, but I am nothing short of amazed that Double Fine managed to continue to exist. Because, not because they make bad games, or not because that Psychonauts sucks, but because their managerial practices and their money mismanagement is legendary. I mean, Broken Age. Just, several people asked me, I'm going to go into this very briefly. Several people asked me to explain the Broken Age thing. I want you to imagine a flamingo holding up an elephant, or trying to, and that's Broken Age in a nutshell. Thankfully, but Double Fine did manage to keep going. We did get a couple of neat games. I myself have played Costume Quest. I can recommend it. And now, in just probably about an hour or so here, I get to play Psychonauts 2. And hopefully, it'll actually be the polish that I want on top of the cool and interesting ideas that the original was. I look forward to all the hate comments for this one. I'll see you next time.